It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Todd Nettleton, and we're going to be discussing his brand new book, When Faith is Forbidden 40 Days on the Front Lines with Persecuted Christians. Todd, I always look forward to speaking with you. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much. I always look forward to it as well. So that's great.
Well, this first question, I think we've covered some of this ground before, but I know you're going to be brand new to many of my viewers and listeners. So we're going to go there once again for their benefit. I know you've been involved in ministry that speaks on behalf of persecuted Christians for many years. Tell us how you got started doing this work. Even in church and ministry circles, it's a unique space that you serve in.
Well, yes, the work of the Voice of the Martyrs is a very narrow and focused work on persecuted Christians. And my start at Voice of the Martyrs came 23 years ago when I was hired and came on to kind of be. They didn't call it storyteller, but that was kind of the job description: is hey, tell stories of persecuted Christians. But the thing I point back to, honestly, for my start in sort of this direction is the fact that when I was 12 years old, my family packed up and moved from Southern California to Papua New Guinea. And my parents served for 4 years as missionaries in Papua New Guinea. So I did sort of those key early teenage years in a different culture. And that sort of introduced me to getting on an airplane and flying for a lot of hours and landing in a place that you've never been and figuring out how to say hello and figuring out how to say, where's the bathroom? And figuring out how to eat food that maybe didn't look like food you were used to or didn't smell like food you were used to. But even more than some of those kind of cultural adaptation things was the fact that God has children of many colors who speak many languages, and we are part of the same family. And so I got a taste of that as a 12-year-old as we moved to Papua New Guinea, and I still get a taste of that in my work for Voice of the Martyrs today. So I feel like that move and that transition was really the first step of the path that God had for me to come into doing this work at VOM.
Well, in terms of kind of the state of the world today, I feel like here in the United States, a lot of Christians say, well, hey, we're finally experiencing some persecution for the first time. Although I keep telling people what we have going on here in the States is like preschool level compared to what's happening throughout the rest of the globe. But in terms of persecution, I guess give us a working definition, like what that broadly means, what that would cover. And then really, at the end of the day, with what you do with telling these stories, why is it important for believers to understand the reality of persecution as it's happening across the globe?
I think persecution is any time someone has to suffer a consequence at the hands of someone else for their faith, for living out their faith. And so, when someone in America maybe doesn't get a promotion because they're seen as a troublemaker or they're seen as, hey, that person doesn't work well with others because they have these really strange beliefs or these really specific ideas about what's right and what's wrong, that is persecution. Now, it's a lot different than getting thrown in jail for 10 years or getting a bullet put in the back of your head. But so that's my definition of persecution. It is just when someone is forced to pay a price for what they believe, for following Christ. As far as why it's important, I think there's two reasons. One is the scriptural call that when one part of the body suffers, we're all supposed to feel that. Well, if we don't have any connection to the rest of the body, if we don't have any idea of what's going on, we can't honor that scripture. We can't feel the pain if we don't even know it's happening. So that's part one of my answer. Part two of my answer is if we really believe that someday we could face persecution, and I think more and more Christians in America are saying, yeah, that could happen. That could happen here. What better way to prepare than to study and know the stories of people who have already been there, they've already gone through it, and they came out victorious. They came out with a testimony of, my faith is stronger now. God was with me in the midst of persecution. Those are the kind of stories that will prepare us for the day when we suffer hardship or even persecution right here in the United States.
Well, you've already mentioned a number of the consequences or struggles that people face in terms of getting shot, getting jailed, a wide range of things. But in terms of people who've gone through these difficult experiences, why are they willing to sit down and talk with you? Like, what compels them to want to share their stories?
I think to answer that, you kind of have to picture the person. And when I started doing this work, when I started traveling to meet persecuted Christians, the picture I had in my mind of what I would do is I would go and cheer them up, like like they're going to be really discouraged and downtrodden, and isn't it great that I can come from America and kind of cheer them up? And then I went and I sat down with them, and they don't need anybody to cheer them up. They are doing fine. They are praising the Lord. And so, what they want is to share their stories because they want to give honor to God. They want to show, hey, God is faithful. God is even faithful when you're in a prison cell. And so that's why they want to share these stories, is because they understand God has done a great thing. God has done a great work, and he needs credit. I want to give him credit. And so when I go and sit down with them, they don't need me to cheer them up. In fact, oftentimes I end up encouraged and even convicted by what they share. But they absolutely want to give credit to God because they recognize God has been faithful even in the midst of suffering. And that's why they want to share their stories.
Now, you mentioned this journey to some degree started when you were a kid, going to Papua New Guinea with your family. But in terms of the wider adventure that you've had through the years, tell us some of the crazy experiences you've had, like strangest places you've stayed. I mean, I'm a guy who travels constantly for a living in the states, and it's pretty predictable. But I'm guessing overseas, just about anything could happen.
It is far less predictable. Let me put it that way. One of the things that I do in each reading in this book, When Faith is Forbidden, is I open up some of my journals from the trips. And so some of those are what you might call more spiritual content about, the person I met, or the lessons that they are teaching me. Some of them are very nitty gritty travel related stories. And one of my favorites, I took a flight in Central Asia, and I sat down in the exit row, which I have long legs, so I always ask for the exit row. And on this flight, I got it. But when we sat down on the plane, I could smell gas. And I thought, that's a little bit disconcerting, when you're on the plane and you could smell gas. But then as we were rolling down the runway, I could hear air moving, like through the exit, like the emergency exit, like it wasn't sealed properly or something. There was air coming in, and I was just like, okay, that can't be good. This is not going to go well. And we called over the flight attendant, and she looked at us. She's like, "Oh no, it's fine, it's fine." So that flight was really, really good for my prayer life because I was praying, Lord, please don't let us crash. I really want to make it safely and get home. Then when we got to the other end, and we landed safely with great sense of praise and hallelujahs in my heart, when we got to the gate, they said, "Now, those of you who are in the front of the plane, you just stay seated down, and we're going to get the people off the back of the plane first." And I'm like, "Okay, that seems strange. That's not how we do it." And then when we got off the plane, my travel companion, who spoke Russian and understood everything that they had said, explained that what they had actually said is, if we let the people off the front of the plane first, the plane is going to tip back on its tail because it'll have too much weight in the back. And so we need the people off the back to get off first, and then we'll let the people in the front off. And I was just like, that it doesn't seem very stable if the plane is going to tip just based on the people sitting inside of it. So um, travel is good for your prayer life, especially some of those flights and some of those places. It's like, Lord, if you don't protect me, we're not going to make it.
Well, I love that the travel has increased your faith. If nothing else, your faith and your prayer life are at a whole new level. Throughout the new book, you give us 40 different stories, 40 different encounters with people from across the globe. For this next part of our conversation, I'd love to have you share a few of those with us. Let's have you talk to us next about an imam that you encountered. Tell us his story and why we might be surprised for his perspective on when he went through persecution.
I met our brother Iman, who is from the nation of Iran. I had the chance to sit down with him and hear his story. And um, interesting thing, as before he started to share his testimony, he said, "Now I want you to understand, I am a very, very competitive person." He said, when I was in the Iranian military and we were fighting the Iran-Iraq war, I told my commander, listen, you send me to the place where the fighting is the harshest, the fiercest. You send me to the place where I can be martyred in the next 24 hours for my country. And he said, when I was a thief, I wanted to steal more than anyone else was stealing. And if someone else tried to steal something and failed and got arrested, I wanted to go and steal that thing just to show that I was a better thief than they were. And he said, when I was a drug addict, I wanted to use every single drug that anyone else was using, and I wanted to use more than anyone else was using. So he said, you have to understand as I share my story, I'm a very, very, very competitive person. I'm like, okay, and then he went on to share his story, and he had a really miraculous encounter with Christ, and Christ healed him from his drug addiction, literally just instantly took away the desire for drugs. And Iman turned that competitive fire in a holy direction. And he said, if I'm going to be a follower of Christ, I'm going to be the best follower of Christ. If I'm going to be an evangelist, I'm going to talk to every single person that I ever meet anywhere. I'm going to tell them about Jesus. I'm going to be the best evangelist that I can possibly be. Well, when you do that in the Islamic Republic of Iran, you're going to end up in prison. And Iman ended up in prison, and he spent some time in a prison cell with about 100 other prisoners. And over the course of the time he was in that cell, he actually shared Christ with every single person in the cell. 24 of them prayed to receive Christ. They repented of their sins, committed their hearts to Christ. They prayed with Iman and became followers of Christ. Now, Iman was only in that cell for a few weeks, and he did all this ministry. And when he got out, he sent in his regular monthly ministry report to his superiors in the house church network that he was a part of in Iran. And he didn't mention the fact that he'd gotten arrested, and he didn't mention the fact that he was in prison. He just said, in the last month, I was able to share Christ with 100 people, and 24 of them prayed to receive Christ. And it was only several weeks later, and I actually met one of his leaders, and it was several weeks later they found out he had been in prison. And they kind of called him up like, Iman, why didn't you say in your report that you were in prison? And his attitude and his spirit is, why does it matter where I was? I shared Christ with 100 people. 24 of them prayed with me to receive Christ. The ministry is what's important, whether it was in prison or out of prison, whether I was being beaten or not beaten. That all is unimportant. What is important is 24 people prayed to receive Christ. His attitude is, I'm going to share Christ wherever I'm at. And that's what matters to me. But he made this amazing statement at the end of our time together. He said he feels like a Christian who has not been persecuted is really missing out on a special blessing. Like it's too bad that they haven't had the privilege of experiencing that blessing of facing persecution, which is something that a lot of us would say, well, I'm not sure I want that blessing. But he said, hey, if you haven't been persecuted for Christ, you're really missing out on a blessing.
Well, next, let's have you share a little bit about Sister Tong. She's a Christian woman who endured some extreme hardships in a Chinese prison. Tell us her story.
I met Sister Tong just a few weeks after she was released. She had served 6 months in prison. Her crime, if you can call it that, was hosting a house church meeting in her home. So the police raided the meeting. They didn't arrest everybody, just as kind of a practical reality. They wrote everyone's ID information down, but the people who were hosting the meeting, the owner of the home, they got taken off to prison. And so Sister Tong spent 6 months in prison. And we were there just a couple of weeks after she was released. And so it was very fresh in her mind, very fresh experience. And I know I'm going to come back to America. I'm going to do radio interviews. I'm going to write for the Voice of the Martyrs magazine, and I'm going to need to tell Sister Tong's story. So, how do you tell a story? You start with the setting. And so I say, Sister Tong, tell me about the prison, because I want to paint a picture of her suffering and how difficult it was. And in my mind, I'm thinking, tell me how hard the bed was. Tell me how big the rats were. Tell me how awful the food was. Tell me about the prison. And my translator translates the question. Sister Tong gets what I can only call a heavenly smile on her face. She says something in Chinese, and my translator says, oh, yes, that was a wonderful time. And I have to admit, I looked at the translator and I thought, now, I'm pretty sure there's a miscommunication here because, I'm asking about prison. She said it was wonderful. What's the problem, Mr. Translator? Are you sure you understood my question? Are you sure you asked her the right thing? Yes, yes, I asked her the right thing, and yes, she said it was a wonderful time. And what Sister Tong went on to say is that Jesus was so close to her during that 6 months in prison. He just ministered to her in such a special, personal, real way every single day while she was in prison. He was just right there with her. And she said, you know what else? There were ladies in my cell when I got there who did not know Jesus Christ. And I got to be the one to lead them to Christ. I got to be the one to introduce them to Jesus Christ. So, number one, Jesus was with me. Number two, he gave me a ministry to do while I was in prison. So why wouldn't that be wonderful? Why wouldn't that be a wonderful time? And the question I thought about that day, the question I've thought many times since, and the question I ask readers in the book is, okay, if 6 months in a Chinese prison can be wonderful, if Jesus is there and Jesus gives you a ministry to do, what is there in my life? What is there in your life that could be wonderful if we had those eyes, if we were willing to see those opportunities? Is it, maybe sickness could be wonderful. Maybe unemployment could be wonderful. Maybe some other hardship could be wonderful if we experience Christ's presence in a new and fresh way, and if he gives us a chance to minister and to have eternal impact in that situation. What is there that could be wonderful if we borrow Sister Tong's glasses and look at the world through her eyes?
Todd, we've touched on two of the stories found in your book. In terms of like the overall journey of the reader in these pages, like what do you hope they take away? How do you hope they're impacted through learning about these stories of other persecuted Christians?
The premise of the book is come with me and let's spend 40 days on the road to meet persecuted Christians. And so these are 40 of the most powerful, the most impacting stories that I've heard in my 20 years plus here at Voice of the Martyrs. I think if you do that, I think if you spend 40 days hearing the stories of persecuted Christians, the natural response after you read every story is, okay, what would I do in that situation? What would I do in a Chinese prison for 6 months? What would I do if I was put in prison in Iran? How would I witness? How would I honor Christ? How would I experience his presence? I think on day 41, after that journey is over, your faith is going to look different. That you're going to be more bold. You're going to understand that God works even in the midst of hardship, even in the midst of suffering. So that's really my hope, is that God uses these stories to really challenge people into a deeper faith and into a deeper walk with Him. And like I say, I don't think you can help but get there as you spend time drinking tea and hearing stories with people who have been through amazing hardship, and yet they come out the other side, just like the apostles in the book of Acts, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer for the name of Christ. When you spend time with that kind of people, your faith is going to be impacted.
And Todd, in terms of the writing journey, getting to spend time going back, looking through your journals, deciding what you were going to share in the book, is there anything that stood out to you in that process? Anything that maybe surprised you?
The thing that jumps out at me again and again and again is just the amazing privilege that I've had to meet some of these amazing brothers and sisters. I am so humbled, and as I've gone back through these stories, and then in the editing process, gone back over them again and again and again. Just thank you, Lord, that I got to meet this person. Thank you, Lord, that I got to have that conversation and hear that story. I think that's sort of the overwhelming thing for me personally. As far as the stories, I think one of the things that comes out is just the joy that our persecuted brothers and sisters experience. Like I said earlier, we think you hear a story of someone who's just been in prison for 6 months, and you think, oh wow, they're probably really sad. They're probably mad that they lost 6 months of their lives, and then you go meet them, and they have this incredible sense of joy and excitement, and man, God is so good to me. God has been so faithful to me. that that is one of the themes that just echoes through these stories again and again and again.
And I really feel last year, just with the pandemic and everything else going on in the world, we got very distracted from much of what was going on throughout the globe. But in terms of persecution, um, has persecution increased? Have things gotten worse in terms of hot spots in the world? Kind of what's the landscape right now?
I think persecution is increasing, and that's sort of the bad side of that story. But there's a good side. There's sort of a silver lining to that story too. Part of the reason it's increasing is because there are more Christians in hostile and restricted nations. The church in the Middle East is growing. The church in Iran is growing. So there are more Iranian Christians to potentially face persecution. The church in China is growing, so there are more Christians to potentially be persecuted by the Chinese government. So, yes, there is more persecution, but like I say, that's also good news because it represents the fact that the church is growing.
And I know anytime somebody reads a book like that, your brand new book, or they listen to a conversation like this, they want to know, how can I get involved? Where can I find out more? So, in terms of people connecting with this book, connecting with Voice of the Martyrs, where should we go on the web to do that?
The book, if you want to know more about the book, When Faith is Forbidden, that's the title of the book. It's also the website, whenfaithisforbidden.com. For more general information about the Voice of the Martyrs or to connect with VOM Radio, you can always find us at persecution.com. That's the main VOM website, persecution.com.
And like we do with every episode, we'll have links in the show notes, places where you can connect with Todd and pick up your very own copy of his brand new book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Todd Nettleton. Once again, our book today was When Faith is Forbidden, 40 Days in the Front Lines with Persecuted Christians. For more on the book, head over to whenfaithisforbidden.com. Or if you want to find out more about the work of Voice of the Martyrs, head on over to persecution.com. And Todd, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's always an honor. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Well, I appreciate it, Sean. Thanks for having me.